Okay. It looks like we're slowing down, so I'm gonna go ahead and get started. It's a very, very full day today. There's a lot of pieces to the COS process. So please just know that the intent for this particular training is just to give an overall um, picture of what all of the components are and all of the pieces that are related to this process. And then also some resources that you can dive in deeper later on your own time or with your teams. TA can definitely help with those sorts of things. But we're really just trying to give a consistent overall to all of the FSCs to what the COS process is and what that looks like. As people are coming in, I'm just going to give the reminder that this is the fourth and final session of your FSC series. So exciting, celebrating all of you. Just that gentle reminder that if you attended all 4 sessions in person with us, you will give that information to your coordinator. Your coordinator will collect it for your program, and that will go directly to Leslie at KITS. And she will be the one creating certificates. Now, if you missed one and you could just and you watched the recording or you weren't able to make them all, that's great too. You still can get credit as far as your FSC hours, and they can still count towards your FSC hours. Absolutely. You just don't have the certificate saying you were here in person. But definitely they can still count towards your FSC hours. We will try to take questions today. My guess is we won't get to a ton of questions. There's just a lot of content. So please make sure you put them in the chat as you are thinking them so that we can circle back. If we can answer them, we'll answer them in the chat or at the end of the session. And if we are unable to do so, we'll come back later with some sort of a document that answers it so that everybody can see the answers. So I think that's it, Jenny. Perfect. So let's get started. I'm Tammy Walleen with KITS, Kansas In-Service Training today, and today we're talking about the Kansas Child Outcomes Summary. Next slide. What we're really hoping to cover and go through today is we're going to talk about the 3 child outcomes, which is AKA those ECHO outcomes, of course. We're going to talk about where did echoes come from? How does that relate to state and federal reporting? And we're going to talk about the 7-point rating scale, the summary as a whole, and how that's all reflected within your IFSPs. Next slide. So before we get started, I'm going to try something new. And this is on Menti. It is a self-assessment. And so what I'm hoping is if everyone can go ahead to this link, it should pop it up for you. It should work. And use this code and just quickly fill out this self-assessment. It shouldn't take more than a minute. And if it doesn't work, we'll move on. But we're just trying to get a general feeling where you guys are together and just give us a platform to start today. So I'll give you about a minute. And if for some reason it's not working for you, it would be great if you can let me know that too. It does look like it's working for some of you. Gonna give it just a couple more minutes. It's going fast and furious. We're up to over 60 people. So all right. One more minute to finish up. I think it's slowing down. Maybe it's slowing down. All right. I think we might be there. All right. I will show these results here in a little bit. And we're going to keep moving. All right. When we think of echoes, only because I don't quite know how to show you the results, I didn't practice that part. So when I know how to show you the results, I'll come back, but I'll have some time to look at that in a second. That's the only reason I'm not showing you the results. All right. So echoes, where did they come from and where did they start? The echoes started very much at the federal level. All the way back in 1993, the Government Performance and Result Act required that all federal programs be able to report data on results of those programs. So in 2002, the Office of Management and Budget implemented the tool called the PART, and the PART is a rating tool that was used to assess and evaluate those all government programs. And so they found that those results were not demonstrated, which means for Part C and also Part B, early childhood special education, there was no data to show program effectiveness of results. And so, of course, under that increasing pressure on OSEP, there was that increasing pressure to produce data on child participating in what results were with children participating in our early intervention programs. Next slide. And so what does that mean? It means OSEP had to respond in some way. They had to produce something that proved that both the Part B and Part C programs were produced, there were results that our programs were effective and showed some sort of effectiveness. And so what they developed is what is called indicators. The indicators are divided into two different groups. One group is your compliance indicators. And in Part C, an example of your compliance indicators is your 45-day timeline, those transition steps. Both of those examples require 100% for compliance. Now, the other pot or group that it was divided into are called results indicators or performance indicators. And results indicators, the targets are set by the state with stakeholder input. The indicators demonstrate a slope of improvement from that baseline data. So our targets do have to move and increase over time. Our programs are supposed to increase in their results over time. And it's just showing that improved implementation of those IDA Part B and Part C services. And so when we're thinking of echo indicators, we're thinking of results or performance type indicators. Next slide. So all the states were then tasked to identify how they were going to implement echoes and identify what those results look like. And so states could choose different paths. One of the paths that they could choose is that COS, the COS process. Some of the states chose to just go with one tool used for everyone within the state. So that would be something like everybody uses the AEPS or the BDI or something like that. A few states worked with publishers to develop tools to support. And in Kansas, as you know, we use the COS process. And over 70% of the states, all of that green, chose the COS process. So for us, when we first started, those of you that have been doing echoes a really long time, you'll remember the outcome web system, the OWL system, which generates reports to OSEP. And that's how our echo data was given to OSEP. Now, when the IFSP was implemented statewide and echoes were embedded, that we were pulled out of the OWL system and we started using our own ITS database. So as FSCs, it's really important that you are entering that quality data because that is what's going directly to OSEP. And we'll talk a little bit about that and what that looks like next. But just for clarity, so we don't get caught up in acronyms, I know some of us are very new. So when I say COS, I am talking about a team process that summarizes information for child's functioning. And there's certain steps we're supposed to do that we'll talk about later. But when we're working as teams to identify that echo score, that's what's part of that COS process. Now, we're going to watch a quick video that just highlights how your data, putting it in the Kansas ITS database gets to OSEP. Jenny, I think you have to unmute.
Thanks.
We'll learn how the child outcome summary data are transformed into the national data reported by the U.S. Department of Education's Office of Special Education Programs, OSEP. Children exiting from early intervention or early childhood special education should have 3 pieces of child outcome summary information for each of the 3 outcomes. A rating between 1 and 7 at entry, a rating between 1 and 7 at exit, and also at exit, a yes or no answer to the question about whether the child has gained any new skills or behaviors. The state agency collects this information from all programs around the state. To demonstrate how this information is converted into the numbers that are sent to the U.S. Office of Special Education Programs, let's start with the progress reporting categories. There are 5 progress reporting categories, each representing progress between entry and exit. When reporting progress data, states identify the percentage of children who A, did not improve functioning, B, improved functioning but not sufficient to move near to functioning comparable to same age peers, C, improved functioning to a level near to same age peers but did not reach it, D, improved functioning to reach a level comparable to same age peers, and E, those who maintained functioning at a level comparable to same age peers. The progress reporting categories can also be thought of as different developmental trajectories. Understanding that children show different progress trajectories is key to understanding the OSEP reporting categories and how the child outcome summary data is converted into those categories. In this graph, age in months is shown across the bottom. 5 different trajectories of growth in an outcome are illustrated with different colored lines. Look at the red line in the graph. This illustrates the first reporting category, A, which refers to children who did not show any improvement in functioning between entry and exit. Note that the red line is flat between 12 and 66 months. All other lines go up, indicating that these children acquired new skills over time. The purple line illustrates typical development and is category E, children who continue to function like same-age peers between entry and exit. The green line shows category D, children who were not functioning like same-age peers in the outcome when they entered the program, but caught up and were functioning like same-age peers by the time they left the program. Both the blue and orange lines illustrate the growth of children who were not functioning like same-age peers when they entered the program. The orange line shows children who begin to acquire skills at a faster rate after entering the program at around 24 months. The blue line represents children who continue to acquire new skills at the same rate after they enter the program. Now, let's talk about how the 7 points on the Child Outcomes Summary Rating Scale become the A to E reporting categories. The 7 points also represent development trajectories as shown in this graph. The 6 or 7 on the Child Outcomes Summary Rating Scale indicates the child is functioning like same-age peers. Expressed another way, a child with a rating of 6 or 7 is considered to be following the trajectory for typical development in the outcome. In the graph, the dotted line indicates typical development. Ratings above the dotted lines indicate children are developing like same-age peers. Ratings below indicate slower development. Let's say a child at entry was given a rating of 2, and at exit was given a rating of 4. When we draw a line to connect those two ratings, we see the child's developmental trajectory for the time he spent in the program. Let's look at some different trajectories. Again, a rating of 6 or 7 on the Child Outcomes Summary Scale indicates the child is functioning like same-age peers. Let's look at a few different combinations of ratings for children who are functioning like same-age peers at both entry and exit. All these children are counted in category E. This child entered the program not functioning like same-age peers, but caught up by the time she exited. This pattern is category D. This is the pattern we looked at earlier. This child showed sufficient improvement in functioning to move to a higher developmental trajectory, which is a higher rating on the scale, but had not yet achieved age-appropriate functioning when he exited. Here's another example of category C. This child showed improved functioning but did not change developmental trajectories. Note the slope of the child's line. It is not flat, which means the child showed improved functioning. This growth pattern is an example of category B. Here's another example of category B. And another example of category B. In each of these examples, the child showed growth but had not moved closer to functioning like same-age peers by the time of exit. We know that a small percentage of children show very little or even no growth while on the program. For these children, we need to look at the answer to the progress question about whether the child acquired any new skills between entry and exit. If the child has a rating of 1 at entry and exit, and the answer to the progress question is yes, then the child's trajectory is going up ever so slightly. This would be another example of category B, because the child made progress even though she did not change trajectories. If the answer to the progress question had been no, then the child's progress would be in the category A. This means the child's developmental trajectory was flat or went down. This is an example of a child who lost skills in the outcome area between entry and exit. Here's another example of category A. Sometimes providers mistakenly answer no to the progress questions for a child who has the same rating in entry and exit. The progress question refers to the acquisition of any new skills. Children who maintain a rating of 2 or higher over time are acquiring new skills to be able to keep the same rating because what is expected of older children developmentally is more than what is expected of younger children. To review, by comparing the entry and exit ratings, we can determine the kind of progress children make during their time in the program. The comparison of entry and exit ratings and the answers to the progress question provide the information for all children's child outcome summary data to be converted into one of the 5 reporting categories. There is one more thing to be aware of to understand how the national data on child outcomes are calculated. The national data are reported in 2 summary statements, which are derived from the numbers in each of the A to E reporting categories. The first summary statement is, of those children who entered or exited the program below age expectations in each outcome, the percent who substantially increased their rate of growth by the time they turned 3 years of age, or for preschool by the time they turned 6, or exited the program. The shorthand for this summary statement is children who showed greater than expected growth. You can see from the formula that summary statement 1 is calculated by adding the children in categories C and D and dividing that number by the sum of the number of children in categories A, B, C, and D. In this example, 75% of children who entered the program below age expectations in social relationships increased their rate of growth by the time they exited the program. Summary statement 2 is the percent of children who were functioning within age expectations in each outcome by the time they turned 3 or 6 for preschoolers, years of age, or exited the program. Summary statement 2 is calculated by adding the number of children in categories D and E and dividing that number by the total number of children across all categories. This summary statement is often described as children who exited the program within age expectations. For the same example, 54% of children who exited the program were functioning within age expectations in social relationships. Now, when you see the national child outcomes data in a table like this, you will know how the child outcomes summary 7-point scale ratings become those data reported about early intervention and early childhood special education. Post data to OSEP progress categories, summary statements.
I think it's done, Jenny. I think it's just going to keep going. We can watch again some other time. I'll put the YouTube in the chat and you guys can watch this later for fun. So when we're looking at what is the overall outcome, what is outcomes, what is that overall big picture? As you can see, it's bigger than any domain. It's bigger than those pieces. What happened was the ECHO project, when ECHOs were funded, brought together a large scale national stakeholder group with providers and teachers, local, state, all sorts of researchers, all sorts of stakeholders. And what they came up with is a very global outcome for all children. And that's a vision that all children, what we would want for all children and families. And so from this is what your 3 ECHO outcomes are derived from. Because we're really looking for the goal of early childhood education and early intervention is to enable those young children to be active and successful participants in that variety of settings with their families and homes and preschools. So we are really looking at a much bigger picture of what we want for children and families. Next slide. So an outcome is defined by the Echo Center as that benefit that's experienced as a result of services and supports received. Thus, outcomes are not a receipt of special education, nor do they identify that satisfaction level of services received. It's really about what is the result of services that have been provided to children. And that's bigger program picture is what outcomes are looking for. Next slide. So what of that video is very consistent nationally that we really have to understand to be able to have quality Echo scores? One of those things is the 7-point rating scale. That constant reminder that the 7-point rating scale is based on child function across settings and routines, and it's the child's functioning compared with the child's age. Next slide. Also really important to remember is those developmental trajectories are a good way to think of how we report to OSEP, and that they come from your COF data. We're really looking for that developmental trajectory from entrance to exit. And what we're hoping and what we want is special education services to increase the trajectory when we are providing services to children. Next slide. So the other thing that I think is always important to note too is sometimes I hear from providers, well, then we should just all exit them out as functioning like same age peers. What I really hope that you're seeing by watching all of this is understanding is that the expectation has never been that all children exit as age appropriate, and that we really are looking at and looking for of a percentage of each of these areas. And there should be children in all of these areas. But we also want that percentage to reflect that our results are mattering and that bigger picture matters. And that's how your data kind of really matters when we think of program improvement. Next slide. So if you're interested and national data interests you, I have the website on the slide. You can absolutely go to ECTA and look at the national data. They have this document that just kind of reviews what I talked about today. And then if you go to the next slide, Jenny, it'll actually show you the national data. And the national data they also have some more in-depth resources to help you better understand it. There's longer videos. There's just more information to get a better picture of what's happening nationally. And if you want to look at local data and see how your program is comparing to other programs, that data is posted on the KDHE website. And so it would be indicator 3 on the determinations form, 3.1 and 3A and 3B. Both of the summary statements will be on there, and you can take a look at your data for your program as compared to other ones. Next slide. So that's as deep as we're going to go into state and national reporting. And we're going to kind of transition into early childhood outcomes. We're going to transition into what does this measurement look like? And Jenny, if you stop sharing for 1 second, I will share your results. And so this is what you guys filled out. Here's your Menti. And thank you. I think most of you tried and some of you didn't make it, but I do think this gives a good overall picture of where we feel like as a state and as a whole, where we're at and where we might need more support. And like I said, this came from a self-assessment that your program can do as a whole off the ECTA website, and you could dive in, or you as an individual can go in and just kind of break this apart and see what are some areas that we might need more support. Hopefully we'll touch on some of that today and get you some resources. But I think this is a pretty good picture of where we are with ECHOS. Thank you very much for filling that out. All yours, Jenny. All right, into echoes. So as you know, I'm sure I'm not the first one to tell you, there's 3 different echo areas, one being positive social relationships, one being acquiring and using knowledge and skills, and one being the child using appropriate behaviors to meet their needs. When we think of echoes, before we dive into any one of those, we really want to start with what's consistent between all 3. And as you notice, you did not hear me say, oh, motor goes in this outcome and speech language goes in this outcome, because they're not domain based. It's not about separating the developmental domains into each area. It's really referring to how is that child using those behaviors to integrate those skills across all of the domains. So each individual outcome area could very well involve multiple domains. And I will also continually throughout the presentation today keep talking about emphasizing on functionality. It's really important when we're looking at echoes that we're looking at how that child is able to carry out meaningful behaviors in meaningful contexts. Next slide. So what do I mean when I say outcomes cross all developmental domains? Here's some examples. The area of communication is almost in every outcome every time, and motor skills cut through all much of the time as well. And here's some examples of what that would look like. For example, if a child can point to a juice box and indicate they want to drink, can the child not only can the child pour, but when are they pouring? They're pouring in the water table in the play group. The child can walk, but why are they walking? They're walking across the room to greet the parent. So you can see how how all of those different just snapshots would include multiple areas in order to make that happen. Next slide. So when I say outcomes, I do mean global. The 3 outcomes are very broad, and they're meant to be a snapshot of the whole child and his or her everyday life. The outcomes are cross-developmental domains in order to see how that child can actually integrate those skills and behaviors in order to participate in everyday activities. So our assessments don't always help us see that functional. Sometimes our assessments require that we ask a little more and probe a little further. For example, for outcome 1, we have to make sure we're asking questions like, how does the child show affection? How does the child interact with each other? How are they regulating emotions? For outcome 2, we're really looking at how is that child problem solving? How do you know that the child understanding you? How are they interacting you with those communication skills? And then outcome 3, how do you know the child's hungry? How do you know the child's tired? How is that child getting their needs met? How do they know that they need something when they're bathing, dressing, eating, that sort of thing? So when we look at all of those pieces together, we want to go further and we want to look at what is a functional outcome. Next slide. So when we think of positive social relationships, we're going to look closer at this outcome. And I'm hoping that this way it's presented is very familiar to you, that we're really thinking of positive social relationships. How do they interact with each other? What does that look like? But ECDA and Daisy have really come out with some nice tools to help us deepen how we look at each of the outcomes. So Jenny, can you go to the next slide? So this is a document that was sent out to you and that'll be in the Basecamp that helps us take a deeper view of what we mean when we say positive social emotional skills. We already know it means having good relationships with adults. It also means things like how does the child separate from adult when they're dropped off at childcare? How are they expressing those emotions appropriately? So I want you just to take a second, and if you can put in the chat, is there anything on this form that helps you deepen your thoughts of positive social skills? Or is there anything on this form that's different than how you've seen it portrayed before? All right. I think for me, one piece, yeah, the several examples. Thanks, Nicole. Yes, that's what I noticed is on the new documents and supplements that ECTA has just put out, there's just a lot more examples that help us deepen what this could look like. And so, of course, as we go to the next slide, the next outcome, again, the content of the outcome isn't changing. ECTA has no intent to change that piece. It's still about acquiring and using knowledge. It's still about problem solving. And yes, Jennifer, I think this would be great to share with parents. And it's a visual that I think makes so much more sense. And it's also in Spanish. So I think that's also helpful. So if we go to the next slide, here's a picture of what we mean when we say acquiring and using knowledge. It's still a lot of those foundational skills for later school success, but it also deepens that breadth of acquiring using knowledge. Is there anything on this one that looks new or different, or anything you like about the new kind of format that they've went with? Yeah, you're very much user-friendly, colorful, fun. Yeah, and lots of examples. All right. And then the last one, of course, they've done the same thing with it. It's still about taking action to meet needs. It's still about moving from place to place. It's still about using tools to contribute to their own health and safety. And then when we go a little deeper, next slide, Jenny. Sorry, lost my voice. Yeah, there's new pieces. I noticed on this form that they even added suck, swallow, breathe. Well, it doesn't say breathe. Suck, swallow patterns for your newborns and your infants. And some of those even more examples for our younger learners, I guess is what I would say, which really helps with that early intervention. Yeah, exactly. This might be something very helpful for families to understand when we're trying to explain and talk to families about echoes. All right. So as we keep going, as promised, a critical characteristic of those three outcomes is that they are functional. Functional outcomes refer to those skills and behaviors that are meaningful to the child in the context of everyday living. As you know, recommended practice for many years has been to write our IFSP outcomes as functional. It is also recommended practice that we look at our ECHO outcomes as functional outcomes. Non-functional outcomes are those discrete behaviors taken out of context. Sometimes we see those in assessment measures that look at those isolated skills rather than in context. And so that as providers and as FSCs, we have to take that extra step to probe more to get that functional behavior and to understand the context and understand the meaning behind the behavior. Next slide. So what are some recommendations for assessing those functional skills? We can think about those isolated skills and observe them. But when we're observing them, we're looking even further to see what that tells you about the child. So for example, if your assessment instrument or you're observing that the child can or cannot point, the observation in itself lets us know that the child can point, maybe, but do we know that that pointing is communicating needs and wants? If we know if we know the child cannot point, do we know that the child can't communicate those needs and wants? How does knowing about pointing at all help you understand how the child is getting their needs met? So it's really taking that breath of looking deeper and trying to find that context in different settings and in different situations. Because those ratings are a snapshot of the whole child and the status of functioning, but it's also the functioning across settings, situations, and caregivers. So we want to know what that looks like, not only for one setting, but for all of the settings the child attends. And we compare that to what we would expect for a child's age. So the purpose of the rating process is not to look at the child's capacity to function under unusual or ideal circumstances, but really how are they functioning in their everyday living. All right, next slide. And so examples of functional versus isolated. Functional skills have to answer that so what question, has to answer why the child is doing what they're doing and the purpose of that action or skill. And so again, thinking I'm not really looking to see if the child, it doesn't help me to know that the child uses their finger in a pointing motion. It helps me to know that that's how they're indicating that they want milk. It doesn't help me that the child can use 2-word utterances. It helps me to know that they're using that to get more milk out of the fridge and that they're doing those other interactions with their caregivers that makes that functional and age appropriate for what we're looking for. Next slide. Other pieces that come up a lot when we're looking at echoes is one, that discrete skill, similar to what we were talking about. And so it's asking teams to look at those questions and to determine and understand the skills that aren't adequately described. We want to go that little bit deeper. So when we think of biting, when we add context, this highlights why context is so important. If I'm watching a child bite a cookie, then I'm going to put that in outcome 3. If the child's pretending that they're a dinosaur and they're playing, I'm going to put that in outcome 2. If they're biting to let another child know that they don't want them to take their toy, we're going to put that in 1. So that's one way where one isolated skill can look very different depending on the context. The other thing that comes up a lot with echoes is it's just too vague to be able to determine your echo. And so in that instance, we see that with words like persist. So we have to go a little bit deeper and not just think we know the child persists, but what do they persist at? Is it at dressing? Is it at figuring out when they're playing and toys? Or is it at maintaining interactions with caregivers? So as teams, when we're looking at those echo scores, we're asking ourselves, what does the child usually do? How does the child perform in different situations and settings? And how does the child use whatever that skill is to complete a task? Do we have enough information to be able to put it in one of our echo areas? So now it's time for a deep breath. Jenny, you can flick these up there. In summary, we've discussed why we need echoes. We've kind of highlighted the histories of where they came from and what they are. And overall, helping children improve in the 3 outcomes supports that participation in their homes, in their schools, in their communities. That data on the 3 outcomes helps us know overall within each program and across the state whether early intervention is making a difference. So child outcome data is that tool that we can use for program planning, which in return more effectively can help all of our programs become stronger. That's why the data is collected, and that's why having good data is so important. Quality information collects and supports and good decision-making and good program planning. And so I know echoes are hard. I know they're difficult, but this is why they exist, and this is what we use them for. So the next piece that we really wanted to talk about today is because we use the COS process, and that's the process we use, the expectation, there's 4 very distinct steps that every FSC should use in order to complete the COS process. Child outcome process was developed to reflect the content of the 3 child outcomes, but it is also a very systematic method for teams to summarize information from multiple sources about the child's functioning. So we need to be consistent with our COS processes within our teams and from program to program. So we're going to review what those 4 steps are and what that expectation looks like. Next slide. But first, let's talk about when I say descriptor statement, what do I mean? What does that mean to all of us? So what those are is it's very important to take that, to remember that that 7-point rating scale, it isn't an assessment instrument. It's a statement, it's a judgment. It's what we use from authentic information to explain the child. And so because the rating isn't a score, it is limited how we use it. So we want to be cautious about how we're using it and what we're using that for, because it is more of a global observation of the child's performance. When do we fill out those echoes? We do it on entry, annual, and when the child exits the program. How do we figure out the echo statement? We really use authentic assessment practices, and we're assessing that child across settings, across situations from multiple sources. That could be observation, interviews, participation in activities and routines, etc. Authentic assessment, when I say that word, what I mean is it refers to that systematic recording of developmental observations over time by a familiar and knowledgeable caregiver about naturally occurring competencies of the child in daily routines, right? It's that information that's captured through direct observation, parent interview, and over time situations and settings. Okay. Other critical assumptions before we can even dive into the process is that first, that the achievement of the outcomes is based on comparison of age expectations. That's part of the federal mandate and is very different than your IFSP process. IFSP processes absolutely measure the child's progress compared with themselves. When we look at echoes, though, we're looking at them compared with age expectations, which means that all of the FSCs on this call and all of the professionals participating in this process have to have the information needed and understand development in order to make sure that they can make a decision on age level expectations. The second critical component is that children of different ages will demonstrate different achievement at different ways, right? And so expectations change with the child's age. So it's also a point in time. Another way to look at it is remembering if I'm looking at a 3-year-old's age expectation skills, that's going to look very different than my 12-month-olds. It's going to look very different than my 2-year-olds. And so I have to understand that it's a point in time, and I'm always comparing back to the age of the child. Finally, it's also important to remember that there's many pathways to performance when we look at children with developmental disabilities. So we should be including things like, how is the child using sign? How are they using their wheelchair? Children may have an alternative but functional ways of participating in everyday life using those types of strategies. All right. Thank you. So all team members bring different information and perspective to child outcomes. That's expected. As a group, each team member completing the process does have to have these core knowledge areas. They have to understand the 3 outcomes. They have to have an understanding of age expected development. They have to know about child's functioning across settings and situations. They also have to understand age expectations for the child's functioning within the child and family's culture. And lastly, they have to understand the 7-point rating scale. Next slide. So, do you need help on any areas? Did anything ping where I need some more? We did send out this nice little graph that helps you kind of highlight some of the things that we've talked about already, and some resources where you can go deeper and look a little bit more if you so choose. If anything feels like I need a little more and want a deeper, there you go. That's the document you're going to want to look for that will help you find that. So, as promised, there's 4 steps to making outcome descriptor statements. The first step is simply collecting assessment, and then we're going to document, and then we're going to use our decision tree, and then we're going to complete the descriptor statement. Each of the teams are expected to follow this process and these steps so that we can get reliability of our data is strengthened. So we want to be reliable. We want to have reliability within our teams, but we also want to, from program to program, to ensure we're using these same steps. Next slide. So the first step is collecting assessment information. And we do have a linked process in Kansas. So we collect assessment information, especially for those initial IFSPs, in a lot of different ways. And so it's purposely linked so that you can use the same, a lot of the same assessments for both eligibility and for ECHO scores. Next slide. So here are the currently used CBA tools. One of the requirements is that every child you have to choose one of these CBA tools to use on the child. Different programs across the state use different CBA tools, and programs get to choose which CBA tools they would like to use. The expectation is that the CBA tool is used in its entirety, so that we can make those outcomes, and it supports us. It also meets the criteria of a age anchoring tool. I know that some of these assessments at different points don't age anchor as well as others, or they all have their strengths and weaknesses. So something to think about is it's also very okay to use supplemental age anchoring tools. For example, ECTA has many age anchoring tools. We put some of those and sent those out to you. 0 to 3 has some. Learn the Signs, Act Early. So if we feel like, while we do have to complete this, if we feel like it's not reflective of the child, we can also supplement with other pieces. Programs don't have to choose just one CBA tool. Some programs like to use some on entry and a different at exit. So the state allows some flexibility for FSCs to find what's individual for each child, what matches, which gives the best picture. But at the end of the day, you do have to use one. And yes, we use it for eligibility. We also use it for ECHO scores. And again, the reason why Authentic because authentic assessment is so vital and needed for eligibility and for ECHO scores, these are authentic curriculum-based assessments. So they are meant to be given in functional ways and allow that flexibility to ask in the context of everyday routines, to probe, to ask across settings and situations. So they're meant to support us. They're also intended to allow us to track progress over time. We should be updating our CBAs every 6 months. We need them to update them every annually. And so this is what we're using to help track that progress as the child progresses. There is a longer list. Riley County is just asking, isn't there? There's more on the list. I'm only presenting the ones that are currently being used. So if the coordinators, if you're interested in looking and exploring the other list, the rest of the list, that is possible. This is just the ones that are currently being used. So next slide. The expectation is also that you're using other sources of data and a variety of sources of data. So yes, one of the pieces should be your CEBA tool. You also use record review, RBI, and other supporting evidence that makes sense for each individual child. So we are also required to use that parent information when we are filling out gathering that data. Next slide. This is a useful tool. If we can collect ECHO information from that entry to that initial IFSP point. And so sometimes we can collect a lot of quality ECHO information in our RBI and just discussions we have with parents. So this tool is called the COS discussion prompts. And this is a form that's in your database or in the Basecamp that you can use to help beef up your ECHO, each ECHO area, if that's an area that you feel like you need more support in. This has some really nice prompts that you can use both with families. You can also use it with your teams as you're trying to make sure you have enough information. Next slide. Parent information is absolutely needed. We need families to be able to understand what's happening across settings and situations. We know families know their child better than anyone else. And so we need to have a plan and a process for how we are including them in that collection of the ECHO information and the ECHO data. Next slide. There's different types of parent participation. There is some information that we get very directly. We just ask, we pull them in. If they are helping us during the ECHO scoring process, we do need to give them some training on ECHOs. There's some other things that we do to support them in equal partners. We also indirectly gather information through parent report, through the other assessments given. We talk to them about their child's progress. We allow them to provide input on strengths and needs. And also something that was sent out is based on the form we talked about before. There's a really nice family worksheet that we can give to families or fill out with families that also helps them see what ECHO data we are gathering, what that looks like, and how we can support. So families can have a varying level of participation and varying level of progress, progress isn't the word, varying level of participation when we think of ECHO outcomes. Next slide. So with all families, though, regardless of how we're involving them in the process, we should be informing families about ECHOs. We should be talking to them about what are ECHOs, just like we talked about today: program accountability, measuring child progress, improving practices. What are we using with these outcomes? We should all be allowing family participate in that data collection. So how are we including families in understanding the strengths and the needs? How are we pulling them in and gathering information from them? How are we individualizing to make sure that the information we are collecting reflects their child? All of those pieces. And with all families, we should be reviewing that data with the families and talking with families about what we found. How does that match with the ECHO descriptor statement? What does that look like? And asking families about that accuracy of the findings. Simply just saying, does this look like your child? Did I capture this? What am I missing? What else should we think about? And involving families in that process. So next, step 2. I said there was only 4 steps. I didn't tell you there's 10 steps for every 4 steps, but I feel like you all know that by now. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to really figure out how to document that descriptor statement. But before we can document, we kind of have to understand what we're being asked to document. So if we dive into the how we would document this, we really have to think and understand about these 3 pieces: age expected skills, immediate foundational skills, and foundational skills. Those 7 points rating scale is very much dependent on these 3 pieces right here. So next slide. Age expected is exactly what you're thinking. It is, if I'm 24 months, I'm looking at skills of a 24-month-old, and that would be age expected. It is for the particular chronological age of the child. Next slide. If I'm thinking of immediate foundational skills and behaviors, those are the ones that come just before age expected development. So to understand immediate foundational skills, let's think of an example of walking, right? When we think about the skills that come just before a child is proficient at walking, what does that look like? Looks like cruising. It looks like going from one piece of a furniture to the next. It's those unsteady steps. Those are the kind of what immediate foundational skills would look like for walking. So if a child is not showing age expected, but is showing those skills that come immediately just before age expected, that's what I mean when I say immediate foundational skills. And then we think of the next one, which is foundational skills. So foundational skills come much earlier in development with the progression of skills. They're called foundational because they form the foundation of what the child will need later. So when we're considering examples of walking, we could think about the skills that come even earlier before they learn to walk. Thinking of those before the cruising, before the wobbling, what does that look like? Pulling to stand, right? Crawling, scooting. If you're looking at your really young infants, you're talking about tummy time. So you're thinking of those children that aren't showing age expected skills, but are showing skills that come way earlier in development. And so those are foundational skills. So next slide. In sum, what you're looking at is that development comes in those predictable sequences. And the child's current skill can be described with regard to a sequence. So this graphic is just that graphic showing how we would expect that to develop, what that looks like. And remembering that those foundational skills frequently are the skills chosen for early intervention, and with a child that's showing delays, because it helps them move closer to age development. So in that ECHO process, in the COS process, those individuals on the team need to understand child development very in-depthly and the sequence of that development to be able to make that rating and know whether the child's skills are age expected, immediate, and foundational. Okay. So this form was introduced to the field in Kansas way back in 2010. So I feel like some of you have seen this. It's previously the expected kind of use for documenting your descriptor statements. So if you're using this tool and it's working for you, that's great. Keep using it. But just like the other form kind of was updated, ECTA has updated some new tools as well to help us document that descriptor statement. And so we want to make sure that what we do want to make sure is, regardless of which form you're using or how you're kind of doing it, the consistent expectation is that the information used to determine your descriptor statement is captured and documented as part of that COS process. So if we look at that next page, another tool that has been around, I just want to remind you, is it's that My Child Story. Those guiding questions on the side have been intentionally implemented there to help FSCs just remember all through those initial processes that they can support you in ECHOs as well. They're not intended to be comprehensive by any means, but they're just kind of another component that reminds us that we should be gathering that ECHO statement and all those ECHO information all the way through the process. Okay, next slide. So just to step back, we're going to review the existing data related to the ECHO. During the evaluation, we're going to probe those caregivers to get that additional information we need to make a good score. We're going to make sure that we're looking at it in the context of routine and everyday routine activities. We're going to compare them to age expected peers. And then we're going to, as a team, look at that score and that information to make sure we have enough information to make a determination for our ECHO descriptor statement. So that's a lot of things happening at one time. And that's a lot of things that the IFSP in it itself cannot capture well. So another form next is this breath note taker form. So ECTA, just like FSCs all across the United States, have struggled with how to collect data for their ECHO statements. So you are not alone. So this is another form that they kind of developed that just allows you to take notes as you see and hear things as you go. And so tools like this are more effective in helping us document that ECHO process as we go and as we go through. An example of why we need forms like this, next slide. Sometimes our observations and our information lean into us needing to unpack it, right? And so when we're gathering information, sometimes it doesn't nicely automatically divide itself in these ECHO areas. So, for example, in this observation, you can see that there's a lot of different outcomes within the same observation. Independently walking to the bookshelf, we would put that in outcome 3. Initiating contact with the dad to bring him a book, we put that in outcome 1. Points to the picture of the cat when her dad asked, we'd put that in outcome 2. So sometimes we need to unpack our observations any further. And so tools like the one we talked about allows us to capture that as needed when we're doing it. Next example. Another example of something that we would collect either in our RBIs and observation can all fit in one outcome, but we usually collect this like after we usually collect this in bigger routines. So it is important that we pull out this component where they talk about washing hands before snack and what that looks like when they dry their hands and all of those components of beautiful things they're doing. But capturing that as we're going with the other information capturing saves us a lot of time and effort. So whether we have to unpack it or not unpack it, we do have to capture it. And so the tools that we're talking about help you capture your ECHO data and your ECHO information. Next slide, Jenny. So the last thing is this form. This is just another example of a form. It lets you capture it. It lets you describe what the age expected is, and it lets you describe whether it's age appropriate, immediate foundational, or foundational. Next slide. And then of course, we do need you to capture all of that and implement it in your IFSP. It's in your RBI. This is why the My Child story should reflect those ECHO scores. That should make sense, and it should flow in your IFSP. And then you should have other supporting documents that helps you really highlight how you get there. If you could picture using one of these forms with a family, I think those other forms also with our families makes more sense, how we unpacked it and pulled it apart, and why that one ECHO score or descriptor statement was chosen for their child. I think this brings information more to the forefront so families can be more equal partners in the conversation and help us see if we've missed anything along the process. Next slide. So one thing that's going to come up and has come up and comes up a lot as cultural diversity increases and our awareness increases, it becomes so ever more important that we recognize how the family's culture impacts child rearing practices and developmental expectations. It is also important that we consider different settings and circumstances the child participates in when we're determining whether expectations are being met. So while age anchoring does involve considering a child's age and abilities, cultural expectations may not line with typical or mainstream developmental trajectories or age expectations. So for example, we know potty training, eating, dressing may be expected considerably earlier or later for some families, depending on cultural norms. Thus, it's important to consider the child's abilities relatively to the family's culture. It's essential that we gain understanding of the family's cultural expectations before determining the child's functioning outside the cultural norms. It's equally as important that we're considering other settings the child spends, what those expectations are, and how the child functions relative to those expectations. So what do we do about that? What do we do about that? We explore additional settings as one option. Another option is just choose another skill to support the descriptor statement. So for example, the child's 16 months old and they're not yet using utensils. We can choose, Jenny, will you flick to the other page? When we can use a lot of different information to get that global picture. And so sometimes it's just more appropriate to lean into our other information we're gathering rather than that one piece of setting or that one skill that we're looking at, that we're really looking at the whole child when we're making these scores. And it's also really important that we're respecting and accepting that family's culture, which means we're not trying to persuade them to change their child rearing practices. Rather, we're just asking the family what they would like it to look like, being open and curious about the family's culture, and we're supporting them appropriately. So what does that mean? We can look at other settings, or we can just look at other skills and other routines that are going on. I am seeing some questions. We're running out of time. And yes, those were new forms. These are all new forms I'm showing you. So we will circle back to answer some questions later. Next slide. Or most of them are new form. Okay, so the decision tree. Of course, the decision tree, whether once you gather your information, once you document it as completed, the next step we get to do is the decision tree. Next slide, the decision tree. Now I'm stuttering. The decision tree is absolutely based on that 7-point scale that we've been talking about. It's important that we gather information and that all of the team really understands this 7-point scale. And I'm just going to review it very quickly. Next slide. If you're looking at a 6 or a 7, you're looking at overall age appropriate. Both of these scores is what we would use if we are considering the child age appropriate. Next slide. 5 and 6 means there's a mix of age expected skills and non-age expected skills. 5 just meaning that there is some or more age expected skills. 4 mean we're seeing less age expected skills. And then the last one, these are the scores we would use if we're not seeing any age expected skills. So just as teams, next slide, in order to move through this decision tree, understanding that 7-point scale is just going to be really important. So once you've organized your information, you use the decision tree, and just remember that that decision tree was not developed as a script for individuals just to read out loud during the meeting, but really the decision tree is supposed to help teams guide and reflect on the questions they need to answer in order to be able to make each rating. And that the team uses this criteria, understands the criteria of each of those descriptor statements. Okay, next slide. Documenting on your IFSP. Next slide. So our IFSP doesn't reflect necessarily that teams are making the ECHO rating, but it is still expected that a team is identified than more than one professional, and that each team member that is making a rating is understanding these pieces, that they're functioning across setting routines, all of these things that we've been talking about, that they understand these pieces of how we're making descriptor statements. As far as how teams can make it, teams can do it. Some teams across the state, I know, do it during team meeting. It can also just be through social media. Sometimes it's through a phone call. Sometimes it's through email. Sometimes you get a chance to sit down and make it. So the method is very open. The requirement is that more than one person is making this rating and the family is involved. Next slide. You're going to put it on My Child's Story. And then next slide. So this one form within your IFSP is representing a lot of steps that are happening and a lot of information that's being captured before you ever get to make it to this point. But the expectation is still, this is where your descriptor statements are. This is where you're inputting it so that it can get to the federal and state reporting levels. Next slide. There are some pieces that are very unique to Kansas. One of them being that you will complete them on initial, annual, and program exit. This is the form, as you know, the ECHO exit is not embedded in the IFSP. It is a separate step. You have to go in and complete this with the family. It does not have to be completed at an IFSP review, but should be completed towards the ending time of services, and that you're kind of having that discussion with the family of where their ECHOs ended in our time with services. Next slide. It does have some, it's still created, of course, with even the ECHO exit uses 2 professionals, the decision tree, all of the same processes that we talked about. And there is an additional progress question on when we complete ECHOs after that initial ECHO. And remembering again, if that child gained even one new skill, we answer yes on that progress question. The other piece, next slide, that we have to remember when we do those ECHO exits is upon exit, you choose one of 4 reasons. A permanent exit is used when they're leaving Part C services in Kansas. A local exit is used when they're transferring from program to program, there is a couple other exits that are within your database. There is an option for a summer birthday. This particular option is very specific to children who fall under that criteria that their birthday is the last day after their third birthday is the last day after the school year of their local school district. These children that we call summer birthday already have an IEP in place with an implementation date of August. And infant toddler is wanting to see them through the summer until August. It's an option programs have. Echo scores for these children has to be completed 1 day prior to their third birthday, but they remain in the database, of course, on their IFSP until August. So one option you can use to input echo scores for these children for an echo exit is summer birthday. It's also okay to just call them a permanent exit, because if you put them as a summer birthday as an FSC, you have to go back and flip it to permanent. If you use permanent in the first place, that's fine too, because echo exit scores are program planning from birth through 3, right? The other common exit is loss to contact. And loss to contact is used when you can't make that contact established with the family for 90 days. So you go in and you make a loss to contact exit, echo exit, to help you remember all of that rich information that you have, but you can't exit them out of the database yet because their IFSP hasn't expired. That's the group of children we're talking about. So there's 2 pieces with that with follow-up. One, if the child returns after an echo exit, you can delete out that echo exit because they've returned to services, so that echo exit is no longer needed. If the child does not return and you end up needing to close them out or exit them once the IFSP expires, one does have to go back in and change this loss to contact to permanent. So we can help with that internally if your team needs a little more support, because it does get a little more confusing than we would like it to be. Hopefully in the new database, whenever that happens, we can clean this process up. But just know echo exit has different reasons, and those permanent ones are the ones getting used for your OSEP scoring. Next slide. A little highlighting on answering no to the progress question. Just remembering that progress question, when we look at that, according to states, less than 2% of children in nearly all states show no progress on the 3 outcomes. That progress, so no progress in children, is very, very rare. So this number reflects that this number is meant to reflect children who have a disability that is progressively more debilitating over time, or showing that regression and not making progress. So most children naturally make progress. We think of those trajectories. So even learning one new skill means the child makes progress. So just remember, loss to contact alone is not reason enough to mark no on this question. You need to have some evidence that the child has either a disability that's progressive or that they're regressing. Next slide. This just highlights what we kind of talked about: 90 days, loss to contact. You want to use the most recent information. What can you do with those loss to contact children? You want to use the most recent information you have available to make that score. That's why we make it within 90 days, so that you can have information to make a score. And you're not trying to wait a year to make this score. And then you want to note, you can also note, yeah, Erica, if they come back, that's when we talked about, we can just delete it out within the IFSP. I'll answer that later, Erica. If the IFSP expires, that's when you would, now I'm all confused. Sorry, guys. Loss to contact, you can make it within 90 days. You're going to use your most recent information. You're going to mark yes unless you have evidence otherwise. And then you can also note in the notes what's happening. You can talk about that the child has been lost to contact and that this is the information you use to make the score because this is the information that you have. And I know there's going to be a lot of not lost to contact questions. So please keep putting them in the chat because we're going to circle back and help clarify this later. Next slide, Jenny. So remember, your parents should be part of the COS process. We need to make sure we're explaining it, we're describing it, we're describing how, the what's, the how, and we're making sure families understand the ECHO process as we go through it. Next slide. We don't have time for this one. Next slide. Okay, so I'm not going to have time to get to special considerations because we're out of time. What I did do is send out a handout that has the next few slides on it. Jenny, you can stop sharing. It absolutely has the next few slides on it to help with those questions like, do you adjust for prematurity? What do we do if the entrance and the ECHO scores are 7s? All of those kind of questions that come up often. So it's written down, it's on a handout. If you have questions, reach out to your coordinator. If your coordinator needs more help, they know how to reach out to us. And that is us flying right on time. I do apologize. Typically it's more interactive and we have more questions, but at ECHOs, we just felt like we needed a good reset on COS processes. And so that's what we hoped for you to get out of today. That's all we have. You can continue to put your questions in the chat. We will, as kits, go back, look at them, answer them, and send something out with answers to your questions. Thank you all for hopping on today.